I am very pleased to be bringing this event to you with our partners. We're putting this on with a partnership with the Vermont Commission on Women, as well as Lund, Mercy Connections, the Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, Vermont Works for Women, and the Women's Justice and Freedom Initiative. So thank you to all of our partners and to everyone else who is here. All right, so just a couple of housekeeping things about how things are going to run tonight. You are all muted, the people who are not the hosts, and when it's time for our discussion period, then we'll unmute people so that they can speak. But so if you try to unmute yourself now, it won't work, and that's why. But don't worry, it's not because we don't want you to talk. We just want to save that until later. So we will have a few people from some of our partner organizations who will speak a little bit and give us a bit of an overview, and then we will move into comments, questions, answers. So why are we doing this, and what is this all about? Well, you're all here because you all care about the future of incarceration for women in Vermont. And all of our partners are actively engaged with thinking about what that future will be like, trying to have some input into what would make it better or worse. And all of these partners and many of you who are here tonight have been working on issues relating to incarcerated women in Vermont for many, many, many years. And I know that some of you are probably feeling kind of pooped about it and possibly a little frustrated that we're still here having these variations of these conversations, but we got to keep on doing it. And so I appreciate you hanging in there and doing this. So just a tiny little bit of background. I'm not going to try to give you a whole education. When you registered for this event, there was an Eventbrite page that had a bunch of resources on it, and some of you may have gone to look at those. There's just some general information, some historical documents that will all be available on our website after this event, so you can go and read more about some of the history. But the short version of it is that for years, the state of Vermont has been moving the women around from facility to facility, has been sometimes doing the things that they said they would do to make improvements, and sometimes not so much. And that there's currently an effort in place by the state to build a new facility for the women. And so the legislature will be taking up next steps on that when they come back in January. And we have been very concerned, all of us, that some of the most important voices in making decisions about what happens to women in the criminal legal system are not being heard. And so part of what we're trying to do tonight is to give some space for some of those voices. So we want to hear from people who are directly impacted by this entire system, people who have personal experience, people who know someone who has personal experience, people who have worked directly with the women, and then just other folks who have thoughts and feelings about this that they feel like need to get known. So we're really uplifting the voice of Vermonters in this meeting to be able to make good decisions about what happens to Vermont women. And we will start off with hearing from a few of our partners, just briefly to kind of give you a little bit of perspective. And then we will move into a conversation where you will have an opportunity to tell us what it is that you think that policymakers need to remember and need to know and understand as they're making decisions about the future of incarceration for women in Vermont. All right, so I'm going to move us on to our speakers. We have three of our partners who will be sharing some information with us. We'll be hearing from Ashley Messier, who is a commissioner on the Vermont Commission on Women and is also from the Women's Justice and Freedom Initiative. We will be hearing from Ronnie Basden, who is from Vermont Works for Women. And we will be hearing from Kelly Moran and Joe Nelson from Mercy Connections. And I will let all of them introduce themselves more fully and explain a little bit more about what they're doing. And so we will move right on. I think we will start with Ashley. So go ahead, Ashley, you can introduce yourself and give us about 5 minutes or so, just a little brief perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Carrie. I also see that Jessica is here. She's down in the corner of my screen. We were waiting for her as well. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining this. This is a, pretty important topic. Has been kind of at the top of conversations for the last several years here in Vermont. So I really appreciate all of you taking the time this evening to share your thoughts and ideas and experiences with us. As Carrie mentioned, I'm the current executive director of the Women's Justice and Freedom Initiative. I am also a commissioner on VCW. I am also the chair of the Corrections Monitoring Committee. But more importantly for this conversation, I'm a formerly incarcerated woman. I'm in recovery from substance use. I'm a survivor of domestic and sexual violence and trafficking. Sprinkle in some mental health stuff there. You don't want to know all of those acronyms. But that's probably the most important identity I hold for this conversation, because it's similar to what many of the folks in our facilities experience, have in their history, have as parts of their story. And so when we're talking about making decisions about prison construction, treatment, programming, reentry services, it's really important, at least for me, to think about what are the actual lived experiences, what are the actual people dealing with, experiencing, going through that we're talking about when we're having these. So I just want to center our conversation to remind us all that these are human beings, right? These are our family members. These are our community members. These are our loved ones. These are people's moms. These are people's daughters, sisters, children. So I just want to mention that before I start. So for the last several years, there has been a collective agreement that the Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility, which is the facility the women are currently held in, our only facility for women in the state of Vermont, is in disrepair. There are many things wrong with it. And there has been a collective agreement, including from former commissioners of corrections, legislatively, all stakeholders, that facility needs to close. It's the repairs would cost far too much, to fix it. It needs to be torn down. Where we tend to differ in opinion is what comes after that, or what needs to happen, after that point. There have been many proposals for new prison constructions starting back several years ago, where there was this kind of giant campus proposed. It was like 950 beds. It included men's facilities, the women's facility, all kind of lumped together in a campus style. And it's kind of morphed over the years to now the option they're looking at is something called Option C, in a report done by HOK folks, which are now the architects working on this project, to build essentially a standalone women's prison, and to also build what they're currently calling a reentry facility, modeled after a facility in Maine, the Maine Southern Maine reentry facility. So that's the conversation. Money has already been allocated to kind of do feasibility studies. Money was already allocated to start having conversations. Folks have traveled to Maine to talk to them. And now we're already looking at land. So where we currently are is land search / talking to the towns and cities where the location might be, where the land might be, including land already owned by the state of Vermont, where other facilities might already be built, or other state-owned buildings and or open land. I think from my point of view and from WJFI's point of view, we've always had concerns. First of all, we don't support new prison construction. We run a No New Prisons campaign, really asking more of the questions about reimagining Vermont, our response to harm, our response to, meeting basic needs, and essentially our viewpoint is addressing the underlying needs and reasons why people become entangled in our system in the first place. That's really our priority. We have collectively asked the legislature for several years now for a study committee on what else is possible. So for example, Vermont currently has no long-term treatment for anything. not substance use, not trafficking, not mental health. We have nothing. Very small amounts of short-term treatment. Our transportation, Vermont is a very rural place. Transportation and housing are difficult for anybody right now, let alone folks coming out of incarceration who are dealing with, other intersecting issues. So we've been asking for a study committee that has yet to happen. They continue allocating large sums of money simply to build the new prison without really thinking about what else we could be doing, investing in, more diversion programs, looking at sentencing alternatives, investing in alternatives to incarceration, local community-based resources that are run and led by, folks in those local communities who know their people best. Secondly, the reality is that Vermont has a stark gap in community reintegration services. So even if you built a $1 billion prison and you had Elon Musk come and build it and it like levitated above the beautiful grounds of Vermont, the reality is that folks are still going to get out into the community and have the same outcomes, because we currently haven't addressed that either. And there's been a lack in the legislature of being willing to fund reentry services across the state, when we have brought, and organizations here can speak to that, brought proposals, brought research, brought evidence that these work and that the outcomes are favorable, and they still refused to fund them. So from the directly impacted folks inside of CRCF, I asked one woman, and I asked if I could quote her without using her name. I said, do you think building a new prison would be effective? And she's serving a 10-year sentence. And she said, no. I still didn't tuck my son in tonight. I still didn't get to see my mom, who is dying of cancer. So this idea that a more trauma-informed, gender-responsive facility is the solution is not. We all heal better in our community. We all heal better with our family, with our friends, with our children. So the reality is that even the people that are living in these horrific conditions that folks want to talk about, and I lived there. I lived when there was maggots coming out of the ceiling vent, falling into a trash can in the Delta unit of CRCF. These women who are living in these horrific conditions are begging not for this money to go to new prisons and new prison construction, but to use this money to actually address their real needs, to actually address the things that would have either kept them out of prison or would give them some, pathways to success, pathways to economic justice, pathways to real housing, real employment, things of that nature. And my 5 minutes is up. So Carrie, pass it to the next person.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Let's hear from Mercy Connections next. We've got Joe and Kelly here. I don't know if how you want to.
Yes, Joe's speaking. You're muted, Joe.
Oh, I'm sorry. Here, that's my fault. Okay. You should be able to unmute yourself now, Joe.
Thank you. In the interest of time, Carrie, I got the straw, the short straw. So I'm Joanne Nelson. Hello, everybody. My colleague Kelly Moran and our experience on this issue is that we together run the Vermont Women's Mentoring Program for Mercy Connections, which is a nonprofit educational center in Burlington. The program matches trained volunteer Women Plus with justice-involved Women Plus at the facility, in the community on parole, and sometimes via referral from the court, the family court and the treatment courts. We've been doing this close to 20 years. Mentors become very healthy new companions. Matches meet face-to-face at the correctional facility, and they begin to build trusting relationships that are respectful, and they continue to meet after release for the transition process and reentry. Mentors model new ways to spend leisure time. They connect their mentees to social capital. There's someone to talk things over with, help plan goals, and they keep their mentees very much accountable to goals. So our experience has a lot to do with that. We also offer a variety of creative educational programs inside the correctional facility for women there, and those focus on their strengths and they give them a chance to reflect on inner lives, and they have a chance to relax and even enjoy the company of others in a correctional setting. Our perspective around this is that every justice involved person deserves to be treated even more than the sum of all their mistakes. We believe in mentoring, and we believe in the power of women helping women, and goal setting and accountability are keys to future success. Our thoughts about possibility of the facility are complicated, but we stand with our community partners in many ways. We know that the correctional facility currently just doesn't have the capacity to be safe and restorative. We know that inmates need trauma-informed and gender-sensitive environment and a lot more programming like that to really have a chance to recover and become contributing citizens again. At the same time, we're deeply concerned about how to replace the prison without perpetuating the problems of the past. And some of the points that I want to throw out for consideration by legislators and policymakers, just a few. Women's pathways to incarceration are very different than men's. A women's correctional facility should include many more smaller number of beds than presently are at the CRCF. Vermont needs better strategy and funding to support women before they're incarcerated, and certainly many more programs and much more support as they re-enter. And now more than ever, women are being released without sufficient connection to services in the community. There's an absolute dirge of safe, affordable housing, and they're struggling with debilitating addiction disease that is at an epidemic level. Thank you very much for having us, Carrie.
Thank you so much. Shall we pass to Vermont Works for Women?
Sure. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you.
And hello, I'm Ronnie Baston. I'm the Executive Director at Vermont Works for Women, and I will aim to be brief in my time to absolutely share the space with the voices, questions, and concerns on this call. Our organization has implemented programming and services within the women's facilities since 2001. We have and continue to run everything from hard skills training and culinary and previously carpentry, paired with soft skills coaching for confidence building, self-advocacy, and employment skills to support successful reentry upon release. But our greatest need in the work that we are able to provide for women is that it grows even more significant and challenge upon release. Our main focus is to reduce the number of women incarcerated in the first place and moving forward. For example, and just one example, is many women leave CRCF without their state-issued IDs, making housing, access to services, employment, even that much more impossible. Our organizations, as mentioned, and many other providers and community-based services do not receive specific funding to allow continuation of services and programs upon release, making it even more difficult who then have to independently access continued services that they were receiving in facility, and for dedicated providers who are providing these services to try to fundraise to support this vital need. Many providers here on this call, and those that are not, continue to provide this level of service just because we know it is a vital need in our community. Continuity of services and programs would allow women to continue on pathways to success with trauma-informed practices to support a variety of needs that were limited by their in-facility time. By providing and funding these strong community-based services upon release, you reduce the needs for a high bed count or more bed counts in current or even future facility discussions. And you're able to provide economic success for not only the women that are being released, but for communities that we all know are in vital need of labor and employees right now. Women within CRCF are motivated, they're able, they're capable to help address many of the labor needs that we face across our state. And we have organizations that stand ready to provide the training to help provide and tap into the potential at CRCF. We work really hard as an organization to try to share the perspective and the voice of women within CRCF to address the conditions of the current facility, as well as the needs of any new proposed facility. Accessing the women inside and hearing what they need is one of the most critical conversations that's not being had widely. We need training spaces. Women need outdoor space. We need offsite work experiences. We need classrooms. We need educational spaces, none of which are in the current facility of well use and not really being proposed in any new facility discussions. This public forum is really vital for individuals and advocates to understand and share extremely loudly the specific challenges here in Vermont, and that there are solutions that could be proposed that provide human-centered approaches to discussions around new facilities that also pair those discussions with necessary inclusion of training, education, diversion programs, support, trained staff, and dedicated funding towards reentry services, so we don't need larger facilities with more beds.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. Thank you to all of our partners for sharing some of your perspective. We could hear for hours and hours about all this, but what we really want to do is hear from all the rest of you. So I'm now going to turn things over to Jessica Barquist from the Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, who will lead us through our next portion. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Carrie. Yeah, so this is our time to hear from all of you, and we do really want to prioritize the voices of Vermonters and those who have experience with incarcerated women in Vermont. So if you have questions or comments that you want to make, you can use the raise hand chat function, and we'll get started on calling you in order. I see one hand so far. So Wendy, you can go ahead, I think.
Okay, well, I have been in Vermont since 2003, and I retired from the state as Carrie Brown's predecessor in 2012. And for all of you, Dolly and Jill and Karen and I'm just trying to think, Jess, this discussion is no different than the conversations that were had in 2003 and were had in 2001 before I came here. And it goes on and on and on and on with no change. Nothing has really changed in the minds of the legislature. There have been wonderful programs. I remember, though, however, when women were made to Chittenden County, moving to Chittenden County, I happened to sit next to Sister Elizabeth at an event, who had been the head of the Agency of Human Services. And she said, you know, the facility was a dump when it was built, and it still is a dump. I have been for the last 10 years a guardian ad litem, and now I see the women through a different lens, but the same lens as mothers. And I've had very, very personal experience recently with a person who was released, who had no housing, who had had no treatment of any sort, no jobs, no nothing. And when the housing collapsed, the brief housing, she's back in. And I am so angry, I can barely stand it. It is just not conscionable. And to think that they're even contemplating a facility with no work experience, no way for the women to work together. And I have to tell you, at one point, I was up at Northwest facility, and we were trying to form a Girl Scout troop. And it so happened that all the women had worked together in the automotive shop. I have never seen a more capable, wonderful group of women working together to solve a problem. And if we don't have good work experiences for the women, either semi-sheltered or in the facility or out in the community, we are going to get nowhere. And I'm not even going to say that every single woman that I have had contact with who has a child, and thank God for Just Cal, it's the only bright spot in this whole thing. And I should just say aside that the men have no ability to see their children at all, except next to the drunken sex offender who might be sitting in the next seat. So unless we forget that at least for the children, we need more. But something was said to me very early on, probably about 2005, the public does not care about rehabilitation. They just want safety, and they want them to lock them up. And I will tell you, I've had personal contact with women who've been charged for very serious crimes. Mental health was always involved, and they were never a threat to the general community. So I don't know how we move the needle on this for those of you who are still in the fight, but I think being nice girls isn't going to cut it anymore. I mean, I really just think that there's going to have to be something that is really, really gets the attention of legislators and some kind of very, very proactive and not just being nice and doing trips to other facilities that kind of get it right. Those examples have been around for 20 years of facilities that do it right. So my goal is no more swish, swish facilities where you go in, the door swishes behind you, and then you have to wait for the door to swish open before you go out, and there are no jobs and nothing for the women to do. So this is a rant. I have no positive things to say, but it's just not acceptable. Thanks.
Thank you, Wendy. Anybody else want to raise their hand? Maybe you have some questions. Heather. Go ahead, Heather.
Yes, I just wanted to say, like, I work directly in the facility, and I definitely agree with everything Wendy said. And I just wish there was a way, because we have some great local training programs that the women could access if they would be allowed to leave the facility for the day. And I understand communities wish to be safe and protected. I don't think these women pose a lot of public safety issues, but if they could get released during the day and gain those skills that could get them marketable employment, if we had technology in the facility where I could organize, you know, job interviews, which most of them are online these days. They can't even apply for jobs online. There are just so many needs in the facility that, like, these women would be much better served in their communities if the communities had the resources. And the fact that DOC funding stops at the door is so incredibly frustrating, because they leave under DOC supervision, but yet the funding doesn't follow them. So it just boggles my mind how, you know, there is on one side that the DOC supervision follows the women after they leave, but the funding, the supports, the programming can't.
Thank you, Heather. Looks like Jana is next. Go ahead, Jana.
Hi, thank you. So I have a lot of thoughts. I will try to condense them, but I just want to say my thank yous to those that are advocating for not a new prison, but something that's different, that can be more community-based. I feel in these conversations, we get caught up in terms like trauma-informed and all these fancy programming and stuff, but we forget that the structure of prisons is one thing and then the culture is another. I feel DOC culture is strong and the abuse and violence in those systems will still be there regardless of how beautiful the prison looks. So I just worry that the women will still be subjected to violence and abuse in whatever this jail will look like. And also, the last figure I looked at is something like 100,000 each person to lock them up in CRCF. And I've just heard like amazing, and I know because I'm born and raised in Vermont, like there's amazing programming that you all offer. So I'm wondering why the legislator doesn't let us just practice with solutions for a bit, like the job training. I know community justice centers have their own transitional housing. Like, why can't we take that 99,000 and try meeting basic needs first? It just feels like making another prison is setting us up for punishment for decades to come, when we really have an opportunity to change how we relate to each other. But yeah, I am a prison abolition activist. I've been in the community for a couple of years now, working on the ground, trying to really shift narratives around incarceration and see what we can build up, which is different. So I really thank you all for this forum.
Thank you, Jana. All right, our next hand is Lisa. Go ahead, Lisa.
Okay, I'm good now.
Okay.
Okay, I'm a volunteer with the, let me see if I can get video. I'll just go. I'm a volunteer with the Vermont Freedom Fund, which is a bail fund. And my experience is really limited, but we have been bailing women out of CRCF. And I'm concerned that every time I look at the statistics on the DOC website, fully half of the women in CRCF haven't been convicted of anything. And many of them can be bailed out. If we just had enough money, we would empty out half of CRCF. And the other thing is the women that I have bailed out and spent a little bit of time with, first of all, there's no plans for them. There's no support for them. And the other thing is that they are in there for the stupidest things. I mean, one of them was actually picked up, arrested at rehab for missing a court date. Now think about that. She was in drug rehab and they arrested her and took her to the jail. And, you know, it's the other thing is we really need to deal with a lot of other systems in order to shut down the jail. Because it's really stupid that you can be jailed, sorry about my dog, that you can be jailed for missing a court date, which is a completely just a routine court date. I used to practice law and I was in the civil side and my clients didn't have to come to the routine calendar calls. So anyway, that's my little rant.
Thank you, Lisa. Oh, Dolly, I see you raising your hand in your video. Let me find you so I can unmute you. Okay. Hi, Dolly.
Okay. First off, Wendy, thank you for your rant, because we always need a rant to light the fire for justice, always. And you're absolutely right about, we've been talking about this for decades. But I also want to remind us, I'm taking a bone density class, and every day I need to exercise to prevent bone density erosion. And so while we're not making the progress that we like, if we didn't have these wonderful activists and workers in the field, we would be much further behind. So don't give up the faith. And I want to thank people like Joanne and Kelly from Mercy Connections and Vermont Works for Women and Jill Evans and Jess at Kids Apart and all of you on the screen and in the field for your faithful, vigilant devotion to these issues and devoting your careers to this kind of work. I really want to thank you for that. Just two things I'd like to us to remember as we fight for no more jails. We must be really strong and demanding in two things: that when the institutions are no longer there, there must be investments in community-based resources. We cannot say no jail and then no funding for Kids Apart or the mentoring program or Vermont Works for Women. They have to be absolutely supported in order to continue the successful work they're doing. And the second point, I think that we need to emphasize, as Joanne stated, that the pathways to incarceration for women are very different than for men, and that the strategies and resolutions for that are different. And that needs to be pointed out. But again, I thank the Commission for having this discussion. I hope that every legislator sees this tape and that we continue our ambassadorship for justice for women. Thank you.
Thank you, Dolly. Next up, we have Kathy.
think I unmuted. I'm relatively new. I've been a mentor at Mercy Connections for a couple of years. And so I just have a basic question. What work is the group doing as a group to talk to legislators about the things that this group believes should be done to help incarcerated women, rather than just us talking among ourselves? What kind of lobbying is going on?
I can try to answer that a little bit. This event this evening is really just an opportunity to get some additional voices into the mix, but we will be providing some more structured information and education for legislators a little bit later on this fall. And then we will see what happens in January. I'm hoping that the commission will be able to have some recommendations to share, but there are many other organizations who are here in this call who are working on the lobbying and on the relationships with legislators, as well as with folks in state agencies and in at DOC and the Agency of Human Services. So I would say that since you're already connected with Mercy Connections, that is a great source for you to stay informed about what might be happening in the future.
Thanks, Carrie. Our next hand is Kelly.
Hi, yeah, so I'm kind of piggybacking off of what everybody's been saying. I work with Mercy Connections and I do the Justice and Mentoring Program. And the mentoring program is wonderful, but we're still seeing people being released, as Heather was saying, where the funding stops and you still have people in the community who need housing and who need basic needs of like soap, shampoo, or even the mental health stuff, and they're not receiving that in the community. So you're just going to see them going back to the prison, basically. I think that's a cycle that keeps going. And so we can build a new prison with a reentry program, but if we don't have those community supports, kind of like Dolly was saying, and Ashley and everybody, we're still going to see this problem. And if you look at the trends, we're seeing mental health problems, we're seeing overdoses, we're seeing these issues in the community because those supports aren't there. And I think a lot of that is attributed to COVID. We released half of the population at that point, or almost half the prison population. At the same time, we had the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, which is great because you're not sending people back for, it's a policy that's not sending people back for minor infractions or using substances, but then they're just in our community and they need supports and resources. So I think it's really important to shift a lot of the money towards the community and have those supports. Yeah.
Kelly.
Wait, Jess, can I respond just to something that Kelly said real quick? So Justice Reinvestment 2 is an important thing that was worked on over the course of a couple of years. And one of those, what Kelly just mentioned, is the policy around not returning folks for what we know as technical violations. And those are things like being late for curfew, having a dirty urinalysis for drugs, things like that are not new crimes. DOC has actually returned many people for technical violations. For anybody that works inside of CRCF, they will tell you that right now, a good portion of the sentenced population are there on technical violations. And now we have seen an increase in what are known as furlough interrupts, meaning that you go in for these technical violations, these small, not new crime violations, people are getting a minimum of a year. A year. I've seen people recently get 4-year furlough interrupts. So there must be a reason, right, that we're bringing so many people back. We need numbers to justify spending the money to build a new prison. And the only other thing I want to add is I just want to remind us to seat this conversation also in the fact that prisons were not created for public safety. They were created to replicate the economic driver of slavery. Like, prisons are systemically, from the very foundation, rooted in slavery and white supremacy. And I just want to remind people, prisons are actually for public safety. If that was the priority, we would be addressing these issues and addressing harm that people are causing in ways that actually work. If prisons actually worked, we wouldn't have any in 2022. If they were an effective deterrent, if they were an effective treatment measure, if they were an effective rehabilitation measure, we wouldn't have them today. Sorry, thank you, Jess.
Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, I'm looking at our time. Ronnie and Wendy, I see your hands up, but just want to put a call out to other folks who haven't had an opportunity to speak yet and share your thoughts and concerns regarding the prison and what you hope to see moving forward. Particularly, I know I'm going to call you out here, but I know we have a lot of people who work in the facility on this call and would love to hear from people who have direct experience with CRCF. I'm not seeing any hands. So Ronnie, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead.
And I will be very brief because I appreciate that call out, Jessica. I just wanted to say to Kelly's point and to extend on, as we make voices loud and heard, we also don't have to have reentry service funding under the Department of Corrections. There are a lot of other state agencies where we could look to really get into this conversation. Department of Labor, Agency of Human Services. There's a lot of other avenues where we don't have to look to corrections to support some of this work being done as well.
Ronnie. Kim. Welcome. Go ahead. You're unmuted.
I wasn't going to say anything, but here we are. Hi, all. So many familiar, beautiful faces on this call together in the struggle still again. I no longer work in the facility, but for 4 years, I was an advocate with the domestic violence and sexual violence, stalking, trafficking, advocacy and education support program inside CRCF called DIVAS, which stands for Discussing Intimate Violence and Accessing Support. I was an educator and advocate there. I know Kylan is on this call, who is currently the DIVAS director inside CRCF, and Karen TS, who is here, who helps shepherd the DIVAS program as part of the Vermont Network. Y'all, the trauma to prison pipeline is real. The majority of people incarcerated at CRCF and everywhere are survivors of various types of sexual violence, various types of family violence, intimate partner violence, lack of comprehensive sexuality education, the cycle of trauma, the cycle of abuse. Many people who are incarcerated, who are socially conditioned and raised as women, are incarcerated for defending themselves against their abusers, reporting or defending themselves against those who are causing them violence and harm, or their partners are the ones who are coercing them to traffic and be quote unquote drug mules. And the people inside CRCF are the ones who are incarcerated. All you need to do is do any small amount of Google research to look at the connection between sexual violence and incarceration, and you will see any number of zillions of reports. If we want to end incarceration for women and LGBTQ plus folks, non-binary folks, we need to talk about comprehensive sexuality education. We need to talk about early childhood education. We need to talk about healthcare, prenatal care, access to any type of healthcare, healthy relationships work. When I facilitated healthy relationships groups at DIVAS inside CRCF, there were people who identify as women who didn't realize that the vulva and the urethra were two separate holes. There are people whose bodies have been used against them as weapons, who don't have information about their own bodies. And when we talk about what it takes to reimagine why we cause and perpetuate punishment, why we try to use violence to end violence, we're really talking about intersecting systems of oppression. Who has power and control? Who's deciding that that women are less than. And that also goes to men who are incarcerated. The fact that we're gendering prisons is another aspect, right? But the majority of men who are incarcerated are also survivors of violence and harm. And so what are we doing to interrupt those cycles rather than building new prisons to cause more blame and shame and stigma to people who are survivors? Thanks. Kylan, pitching it to you if you want to pick it up.
Thanks, Kim. I'm actually going to go to Jess from Kids Apart. Good. Thanks for joining us.
Hi. So to build on that conversation about trauma, you know, what's the collateral impact? The collateral impact is the children and the generational trauma that's perpetuated. Having an incarcerated parent is an adverse childhood experience, right? So incarcerating parents is creating trauma for children. And we know that there are so many women in this building whose needs we've been talking about that this evening and for so many years, their needs can be met outside this building in ways where they're integrated into the community and present in their children's lives. And, you know, I've been in this role for 15 years having this conversation. And it's, you know, it's frustrating to see, it's frustrating to still be having this conversation. I know that I arrived midway into the conversation. Jill Evans is on here and other folks who have been talking about this issue for multiple decades now. So I just really always want to highlight the impact on kids and how much we also need to be talking about avoiding incarceration in the first place. Whenever we're talking about, you know, about the situation, we're not talking about what happens the first time somebody has contact with the criminal justice system and what interventions and treatments can we be putting so much further upstream so that folks don't wind up here. I don't have the answers to those big questions, but I just wanted to make sure that they were put out on the table. So thank you.
Thank you, Jess. And thank you, Wendy, for being patient. Kylan, I see your hand, so you are unmuted.
Hi, I'm so sorry for jumping in late. I'm mobile for the second half of this, so I've been listening, and I wanted to pull over before I started talking. But yeah, I agree with everything that everyone said. I think that something that is really that I think is notable is similar to what Kelly said, is that, you know, in light of the pandemic, when we were all sort of coming together as contractors to pivot our services to provide a completely different model than what we had before in response to people being released, I think we found that a lot of services, like Jess said, you know, can be provided outside of the building, and what people need is like the tangibles and basic needs being met, housing and food, and like being able to be connected to their children. And then without those things, there isn't room, there isn't space for people to have the capacity to start the unpacking the intense trauma of being incarcerated and everything that's happened before it, and then substance use issues and you know, family violence, like stemming back to childhood. The statistic that we always use in Divas is that, you know, 96% of the women that we work with have an instance of domestic violence, sexual violence, or human trafficking, most often a combination of the three. And as much as we can provide support and you know, education and all of those things in the facility still continues to not be a necessarily safe space for people to do the unpacking of all of that. And not knowing where they're going to live, not knowing where their meals are going to come from when they leave, is not setting up people for success. And I don't know if a new facility would change that. That's my piece. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Kylan. We just have a few minutes left, and I just want to offer up that if there's anybody on this call who has lived experience of living at CRCF, if you would like to comment, we'd love to hear from you and your perspective. While you're thinking about that, Wendy, I'm gonna unmute you. Thank you so much for waiting.
Okay, I don't want to be a wet blanket about community supports, but I have been working with a family treatment court for the past 8 months, where women are giving all sorts of opportunities to be with their family. They're followed weekly with all these things, but we don't have enough services. You know, they sit there and they wait for a bed at Valley Vista, and then they can't get there. You know, we need much more supportive environments. Where women don't have to try to find a place to live if their house burns down, don't have to fight for food, don't have to schlep and try to get rides probably from some of their former druggy friends to get to the services that they need. I mean, we've got to have some interim thing that just doesn't throw people out and say, oh, well, there's service A, B, and C, and D, and you're going to have to find some place to live and get the bus there. And by the way, you have to furnish your apartment and get clothes. You know, we've got to imagine, and I'm sure there's some places that have this, or if they have to be in a safe environment, they get really intensive mental health services. And you know, like the intensive outpatient-based services, they get them. If they're going to have to be inside, as far as I know, we still have no intensive mental health services for people in the prison. Intensive programs that deals with their trauma. I mean, we did a survey, 15 years ago, that the highest percentage of the folk there would have been classified as seriously, persistently mentally ill. They have huge amounts of childhood trauma. So I don't think we can just say, well, let's get rid of it and put them out there and just provide a nice little smorgasbord of community services, because I'll tell you, it does not work, and it's very discouraging, but it's got to be much more, some way, supportive for them and safe for them, really safe. It's not safe out there. Thanks.
Thank you, Wendy. We just have about 1 minute left, so I am going to invite Kristen to join us.
Hi, I just wanted to add to the voices that were already on, what we need is also more options. So I think we're talking a lot about who isn't being served at CRCF, and that's everyone, but also when I look at the community needs, excuse me, people need different things. We don't have everybody's needs, but we don't even have options. I'm getting emotional just thinking about transitional housing in this community. So, excuse me. Some of you were all the same group that kind of gathered around Northern Lights when it closed, and it wasn't perfect either, but I think partly we're just dealing with a loss of options. And so I just think this group and all the community providers who are trying to serve these people, we just need to have a range for people, because if there's only like 2 options, they're going to take one or the other. And yeah, I work with reentry at Burlington Housing, and so we can serve like a very small population, but it's only people who have a year or more on supervision. And so when I have to say no to someone, no, you don't have enough time, or no, you don't meet this criteria, the next step is, what can I give you as like another place to look? And there just isn't any. So I'm just emotional because we don't have options to give people. And I think people need choice in order to have hope in their lives and control. And so I'm just hoping we can find a way to include more autonomy and more choice, whether that's in that facility. Hopefully, if we do need to keep something, it's going to have options that don't look the same for everyone. But in the community, I think is what we're all hoping to kind of fill in those holes that people are lacking, from mental health to housing and everything in between. So sorry for my emotions, but it's just, I know that we're all passionate about this, and it's a hard conversation to have.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And I'm going to turn it over to Carrie to close us out, but just want to say thank you all for being here to listen and to share all of your perspectives. And I'm pretty sure I can speak for all of the sponsoring agencies and say that we want to hear from you. And so if you didn't get a chance to speak tonight, or you weren't comfortable in a public forum, like, please reach out and let us know your thoughts on this issue so that we can make sure that we are communicating all of that to the legislature as this process moves forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. And yes, I will echo what Jessica has said, that there are a lot of you here who may have not gotten a chance to speak, and or may have not wanted to speak in a public setting, which is completely reasonable. And yet we still want to hear from you. And we will be continuing this process of reaching out to hear from people to get some different perspectives and send them on to legislators. As I said before, some resources will be on our website. We'll be back in touch with a follow-up email to all of you to point you to those. And thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And let's hope that we have a better version of this conversation in the not too distant future. Thanks, everyone.